Today's video is brought to you by a really unfortunate chain of events. This is actually on the honey-do list. My wife said, you know what, wouldn't that door be cooler if you just gave it a once-over? Maybe we even go with a different color. I'm like, no man, I love the color red on the front door. It's gonna be so cool. And I'm super excited about it because I know what to do. I'm going to go to Tractor Supply and I'm going to get the components, it's paint and it's catalyst, and it's reducer. I'm just going to grind it down with some 320, and this Smith is going to be busted. I'm going to have this door in place in no time. And I'm going to get my little hero badge, and my wife's going to love me. So I sand it all down, I wipe it all down. I'd be willing to bet there's a lot of finishers out there that go, you wipe it all down with a wet cloth, just water and a rag, and that's exactly what I do. Taping off the door handle because I have to leave it on, because if you use red thread lock and not blue, it's staying. There's no getting away. So these are the parts. These are the components that you get from Tractor Supply. I've done this a couple of dozen times. It's really easy. I just add it all up and get my mixtures right. But then I see this mess, and my spidey senses, my red flags, they're going off. This isn't good. But I keep going with it because I'm thinking, what could possibly go wrong? I do all my calculations on a calculator. I use a scale, and I use a mixing bucket, but I use all of my numbers through the scale and just add it up. And the manufacturer is going to tell you about, 10 or 12% reducer. But I see that as I pour that paint into that filter, it's not going through the filter. So I'm trying to just encourage it to go through the filter. And I get it thin enough, barely, to come out of my sprayer somehow. But I'm not happy with this finish at all. It's not laying flat, and it doesn't seem to be drying. And I put enough catalyst in there, and I definitely used a lot of reducer. I want this stuff to get rock hard, and I want it thin enough to spray. I'm up to 60%. I end up going to 70% reducer, and it's still just barely just squeaking through that filter. And I'm like, well, maybe just maybe I can get lucky. And I've kind of shown some calculations. They're not going to mean much to you because you don't know exactly what's happening here. But I was really trying to hone in and keep everything accurate. As I was adding my reducer, I had to recalculate how much catalyst was going through there. And I mixed everything thoroughly, and I was going to have to just try this again. It's getting kind of late. I'm getting discouraged while I try to encourage the finish to go through the strainer. And it came out a little bit better, but yeah, now 10 hours later, I'm looking at this going, it's not drying, and it just peeled right off. And so hours ago, this should have been dried. It's coming off it's like bubble gum or something. It's like soupy bubble gum that's been sitting out in a hot Lincoln Town car in the summer somewhere. And so I've got to put on the gloves. I'm just hogtied here. I'm totally flabbergasted. And I've got to get in every nook and cranny, and I'm using all my scrapers. I'm using crown molding just to get as much off as possible so that I can get to the point where it's dry. And this, on this tape, even on the masking tape, that should be dry, and simply put, it's not. So I scrape it all off, and it's not dry until the following day, which makes me really sad. I was so bummed because I'm at a loss. It's rock hard now. Now that I scraped it all off, it dried nice. My only play here is I've got to remove everything. I've got to go right down to metal. I've got to go through the paint I just put on last night that didn't come off, through the paint that I was trying to cover, and down to probably beyond my primer coat, and then the primer coat that came out of the door. So I'm using every sander, every gadget, every little grinder, and I'm trying not to ruin the door or the little plastic trim around the window. I don't know at what point I'm going to burn through the metal with this grinder, and I'm causing grinder marks, and it's bad. So I send that portion of the video off to a friend of mine that I would consider the finish whisperer, and he goes, yeah, that paint sat on the shelf too long. So I'm looking for supply houses to find some automotive spray components, and this is what I ended up with. I ended up with an epoxy primer, and then I had another trip to go get regular primer, and I learned quite a bit today. The epoxy primer is more like a sealer and less of a primer. You're not supposed to sand it. It's a sealer for the primer. It's to protect your metal, but it also protects your sandable primer, as I understand it. So the challenge today is time. The best way to remove the paint, try not to damage the door, and put together a plan to use the products I know nothing about. I have to race back after I get these products, do as much research as I can as fast as possible, because I have a piece of Visqueen over my door, over the entrance of my home, and I've got to get this done not in a couple of days from now, but by the end of today. This has got to be done. So this is where one of my favorite sayings, I wish I was smarter, faster. Because by the time I get to this point, it occurs to me, I can use the paint at Tractor Supply. All I really had to do is go up, buy 4 or 5 cans, and either open them up there, bring them back to my shop, open them up at my shop, and just find the one that hasn't been sitting on the shelf for years. When I went to the paint supply, the gentleman talked me out of even trying to spray it. Why? The only thing I can think of is that when I told him, I'm pretty familiar with finishing furniture with a sprayable product that's catalyzed. I just need some advice on the best product for my door if I were to use a sprayable automotive finish setup. Basically, the only thing he seemed willing to sell me was the epoxy primer. I don't know if it was because I just wasn't in the club or what the deal was, but in my, I came back with the primer, and in my quick research, I learned that there is an epoxy primer, but you need a catalyzed primer to go over top of it so that you can sand it down. Why he didn't tell me that or sell me that does not make any sense to me at all. So I went to a different store, and they carried it, and they were happy to sell it to me. And I knew that was a really important step. You have to have a primer that you can grind on a little bit, because I put some marks and gouges and just sanding marks all over this door, and there's no reason to even do this if I can't get those out, because that's a texture that's just not going to work at all. So I left the automotive paint supply store, and I ended up at a little mom and pop shop that sells house paint. And I really just didn't want to paint this with a brush and a roller, but the young lady that was working there, she convinced me that I was going to be able to go over this with a regular house paint. It was going to be glossy, and she was going to set me up with a nice brush, nice roller, and it was going to lay down flat and level out really nice and have a nice sheen to it. And so I took her advice. I picked a color other than red, which That's what the girls around here wanted. They wanted like a bronze or a brown kind of a tone. So I started cutting everything in, and I painted the door, and I'm just really not happy with the fact that it doesn't seem to be laying flat at all. And what do I do in this case? That's exactly the look I didn't want. So, not that big of a deal. It's the first coat, and as it dries, it did kind of level out. So I'm just not satisfied. I'm still not satisfied. I'm taking a block sander, and it's starting to gum up, and I'm, again, racing against time. It's nighttime now. And so that finish is still soft, but it's just hard enough if I just gently go over it with some 320. I can flatten it out a little bit further. Luckily for me, I was smart enough, fast enough to have come home, done a lot of research, and figured out that there was a primer that goes over top of the epoxy primer. Because that way I can grind it down and I can sand it and get all of the scratches that I caused with the sanders out of it, or at least most of them. And the minimal sanding that I had to do on the first coat of this paint wasn't that bad. Now, it wasn't going to turn out like this that some guy did, but I can kind of embrace it. If there's going to be a texture there, it's not the end of the world. That's what I convinced myself of. But if I just take my time and use those brush strokes in a controlled fashion where they start and stop at certain points and they're straight lines, it's actually kind of growing on me. It's really not that bad. I don't really mind it. It's not perfect, and it's not what I expected. So in there somewhere is a lesson where I go, well, you might just have to adjust your expectations. And I was striving so hard for that sprayed finish. But in the end, you know what? I'm actually pretty happy. There's plenty of information out there on any one subject, but the real information comes from just getting into it. I always marveled at how nice and neat a good house painter gets a door painted. I always thought, man, how do those guys lay down pinstripes by hand so perfectly? The answer is nobody rolls out of bed knowing how to do it. They have to make mistakes and keep on trying. And you just have to work hard, and sometimes you got to work long hours. And if you just stick to it, you might be surprised that you come out with a golden sense of accomplishment. This didn't turn out bad. I'm actually pretty darn pleased with it. And I learned a few things. I can only hope that you did too.